Hello and welcome to Parent Talks, a presentation of St. Michael's College School. My name is Lianne Castelino, Director of Marketing and Brand Strategy at the school and your moderator for this event. Parent Talks is an initiative of the Student Affairs Department and Community and Learning Partnerships at St. Michael's. Today, we are delighted to bring you a bonus edition of Parent Talks for this academic year based on feedback received from our current parent community. Our focus tonight: tips for learning success in the summer, online, and beyond, a conversation. COVID-19 has certainly thrust the world full force into the digital era. We will explore distance learning via digital technology, looking at evidence-based research. Also, what does the future of digital learning look like? We will tackle that as well. We are using the Zoom webinar platform, and we just wanted to point out that if you have questions throughout the course of the 60 minutes, just go down to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and we will do our best to get to it throughout the course of this event. Now, let's meet our panelists. Frank Trentadue is the Director of Student Affairs at St. Michael's College School. The department comprises guidance, the Learning Enrichment Center, and the Odette Library. He is currently the longest serving faculty member on staff, having been at the school for 31 years. He was a classroom teacher for more than 20 years, then served as a guidance counselor for 9 years, and he's been the Director of Student Affairs for the past 3 years. Along the way, Mr. Trentadue has been a coach, a football coach, for more than 30 years. He is also the Chief Architect of Parent Talks. Dr. Amélie Lemieux is an assistant professor of literacy and technology education in the Faculty of Education at Mount St. Vincent University in Nova Scotia. She is a TEDx speaker and recipient of the Lieutenant Governor's Medal in Quebec for academic excellence and community engagement. Dr. Lemieux has received funding from the federal and Quebec governments to investigate digital literacy practices, working with adolescents and teachers to document literacy event processes using mapping. She's also the author of Deconstructing Literacies: Considerations for Engagement. Dr. Mark Broussenko is a family physician and a hospitalist at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, in Toronto. He has been a staple of every Parent Talks event since they began in May of 2019. Dr. Broussenko is also an alumnus of St. Michael's College School, having graduated in 2007. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Let's start with, a general question about the topic that we're going to tackle tonight. Frank, I want to start with you. What would you say has struck you most about the impact of the pandemic on the digital world?
Thank you, Lianne. Let me begin by thanking all of the parents in our community to begin with for two things. One, for entrusting their kids unto our care, but also I think during this pandemic, we've sort of turned them back over to the parents, and we're relying on the parents to partner with us in raising and develop these young minds. So we really appreciate some of the frustrations that might be going on at home, and we're here to support, I think, whatever we can as far as the development of these young men. When I think about or I reflect upon the impact that this pandemic has had on us, the first thing that comes to mind is the speed at which we had to make this transition. Not only the teachers who had to very nimbly and with a lot of agility make a very quick transition to an online environment, but also the students who were receptive of all of the learning. And that speaks volumes to, I think, a lot of the resilience that they've been showing us during this time. And so the other thing I think that struck me more on a personal level is the fact that this pandemic has touched a whole lot of layers. And, things that we have taken for granted for so long, now we have to pay attention to. For example, just picking up a ball and throwing it around, and we have to be careful about what we're touching. And I've organized my days around my work and my errands, and I felt like if I didn't get everything in on one day, that my day would be ruined. And here I am sort of in my home, and all those things that kind of guided my life prior to this are no longer that important. Things do get done, and there's time for it. So So those are the things that kind of struck me about, the impact of this pandemic. And I think for all intents and purposes, that might have, some impact on how the kids at school are approaching their academics.
Dr. Lemieux, thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with Mr. Trentadue on how fast and how quick that shift has happened, especially at the university level across Canada. So certainly that came with a lot of adjustments. Now, there's a lot of research that stipulates that there's not an online and offline world anymore, and that they're just blended together. I tend to agree with that. I mean, you're going to see your adolescents engaging in what we call micro social movements online. So think about TikTok, think about Instagram, think about Twitter. There's a lot of teachers as well who post stuff that happens in school online. So I would say the frontier between online and offline is often blurred. So we're aware of that. Our kids have cell phones and it's everywhere. So that's one reality. The second reality is that if we're taking schooling at home, we're also blurring those boundaries. And without romanticizing this, what gets picked up is that you have different generations that engage with each other, but you also have the adolescents that engage with each other. I understand the concerns of parents about spending too much time in front of a screen. And I think it becomes a concern where it drifts into an addiction. Now, I trust that Dr. Broussenko will talk more about this, but for me, it's more of an over-reliance on the digital that can become problematic. So things like blue light, for example, that can disturb sleep cycles is certainly one thing. The UNICEF has just published a report on digital literacy in the times of pandemic, and what they were saying is that in terms of parenting, it's not so much about the continuous time that kids spend online, but it's also about what they do online. So if they do reading, which they do, so they don't read the image like this, they read the image by looking up and down, things like that. So when you turn into digital literacy in that way, you're changing that from reading a book, and your eye is adapting to that. You want to have a look maybe at what kids are consuming online. So I often have questions about monitoring and things like that. So that's one thing I would be inclined to be in line with the UNICEF report on digital literacy in terms of that.
Mark, before I get to you with that question, I do want to remind our viewers that we do have a poll question tonight, and we will have those results during the course of the hour. The poll question is, are you concerned about your child's level of engagement in online learning moving forward? So we invite you to participate, and we will have those results shortly. Mark, just a quick thought from you in terms of what you're seeing through this pandemic and its impact on the digital world. As a physician, certainly we're aware of healthcare and how it's been radically impacted by digital technology during this pandemic, but also as somebody who is on the front lines of mental health at CAMH, what are you seeing there?
So thanks for the question. I think as we move forward, one of the things that's become more and more apparent is that this is very, very much a marathon and not a sprint, and so there's a lot of adjusting to a world of new normal, and that's a new normal in terms of remote work environments, remote learning environments, maybe a more rapid progression towards digital versions of previously, I guess, real world bound institutions and organizations, like education, right? And so that's something that has been technically possible for several years, but we really hadn't had a push to move towards it at quite this rate. And so I think one of the realities is, as we move forward from COVID, a lot of these things are not going to go away. And I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you, which areas of your life will go back to the pre-COVID normal and which areas will be changed forever. But one of, when you look at some of the theories that describe past historical events in terms of theories of social change, the concept of a revolutionary event or a revolutionary process suggests that things kind of move sometimes incrementally, but sometimes by leaps and bounds over a very short period of time. And from adapting to the new world, worldview, your teenagers are actually probably some of the most resilient and some of the most adaptive people out there. They're much more able to fluidly transition from a brick and mortar environment into an online learning environment, much more so than people who have who are quite entrenched in their previous professions for 10 or 20 years. That said, though, that exposes you to different forms of vulnerability. And some of the conflicts in terms of bullying and some of the conflicts in terms of self-esteem and some of the issues that arise around mental health and an over-reliance on digital or immediate forms of validation tends to get amplified. So before, if you could avoid your bully in the hallway, just you could avoid that conflict. The digital world makes it much harder for people to create distance, and I think we're seeing that with certainly higher rates of substance use and particularly depressive disorders, especially as we've gotten into months 2 and 3 of the pandemic and going forward.
A reminder that if you do have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Before we get into more questions here, we do have our poll results to share with you. So once again, the question is, are you concerned about your child's level of engagement in online learning moving forward? 92% have said yes. Are we concerned about that, Frank? That's a high number. Frank?
So it's always a concern, but I think we're faced in a situation where we've put the students in front of screens at this time, and they're in front of the computers for 6 hours a day, and they've already accustomed themselves to using a lot of their leisure time in front of the screen, whether it's gaming or doing their own research or chatting and whatnot. And so we've kind of compounded the problem by putting them in front of the computers. And I think probably one of the things that we can do to reinforce or to lessen the damage that this might do is to reinforce the time management skills that are required to live or navigate the kind of world that we have been forced into. And that means, structuring time and organizing routines and so on and so forth, so the students can get into a rhythm of what each day looks like and stick to it.
Dr. Lemieux, what's your take on that?
So absolutely. I think it's a great poll, great question. I know that parents are overwhelmed because they're not teachers and they don't feel like they're teachers and that, they don't have that background. But what's great about parents is that they went to school for a long period of time. So they do have some kind of practical experience with what schooling is and what kind of relationships that we develop at the high school level. So that's one thing. I think there is a silver lining in all of this, and I'll explain that more vividly. So I'm a strong advocate for cultivating awareness and digital literacy practices rather than policing. So in the verb policing, obviously we have the root police. Nobody wants to be policed, especially not adolescents. So I'd like to turn this around and to really foster a culture of digital awareness in adolescents and work with them and not against them. So what that means is that I think this is a great opportunity to teach about issues of privacy for both parents and adolescents, okay? So a key question could be as simple as asking your boy, how many pictures of you are available online? And what this means. And why should we care? And how can we take this opportunity to teach about privacy and security online? What is stored where? And who has the rights to our pictures, for example? So that could be an entry point in thinking about how we spend our time online, which goes back to my first intervention. There's time, yes, but what are we doing online? If we're creating digital productions, if we're engaging in gaming, if we're socializing with people, I think that's one thing. If we're seeking attention, if we're doing problematic behavior, if we're engaging in bullying and things like that, this is where the digital is darker. And I think when we police, we can, it tends to generate darker responses. So I want parents to be aware of that, okay? So to move from a dynamic of policing to a dynamic of cultivating awareness is to show as a parent that you're vulnerable as well, and to say, listen, let's learn more about security and privacy today. Let's do, say, for example, house rules about digital engagement. So if you say no cell phones after 9 p.m., it's no cell phone after 9 p.m. for everybody, so that there's not a divide between the parenting and the adolescent, and that we can work together towards safer digital practices.
So we're going to break a lot of those concepts down as we continue this discussion. But Mark, I wanted to ask you, because one of the questions that we've gotten repeatedly from parents in preparation for this particular event is how to motivate their teenage sons, especially during this pandemic, whether it's to continue to be engaged in their academic learning, whether it's to use this time to do something else, learn a new skill, etc. The question is about motivating a teenage boy. Any thoughts on that?
So I mean, I think that's it's both an easy question and a very hard question to answer at the same time. So I'll try to give it the consideration that it deserves. I think one of the and a lot of our research about mental health and performance failures in terms of demotivation and dysthymic disorders really starts to crystallize around the concept of structure and organization. And so many of you, especially those of you who are working from home or are having to deal with kind of a more digital or more distributed office, have probably noticed this about your own lives. There's something that makes structure during a day much more productive and in general much more effective. And that's why many of us have specific times that we're supposed to go to work, and we plan our meetings, and we have start times for exercise classes and start times for practices and all of this. There's a certain concreteness to it. And once you remove that, once you move into more of a free flow environment, both in terms of organizational structure, so get up whenever you want, check some emails, maybe schedule some meetings, maybe don't, work on your own time, and also just 3D space structure. So get up in your PJs, walk to the kitchen, listen to a lecture while eating breakfast, go back and lie in bed, read some books. Those sorts of things tend to actually and have been shown in people long before the pandemic to be predictors of negative performance. So I mean, I understand that it's impossible to turn everyone's home into a classroom, and certainly it's impossible to turn everyone's home into an office and with discrete working spaces for 3 people. But an easy tip would be to create a sort of semblance of routine that mirrors that of school or work in your everyday lives. So get up at a consistent time, eat breakfast undisturbed, then go do whatever it is that you were supposed to do in the morning, and then set aside breaks. Set aside breaks like recess, set aside breaks like lunch, set aside breaks for after school activities, and then go back to homework. As opposed to this, very organic kind of free flow existence where you do whatever you feel like, as long as everything gets done at the end of the day. Many people find that without that kind of organizational structure and deadlines for activities, what ends up happening is you start to feel overwhelmed, and people's efficiency and productivity starts to go way down. So those are just some kind of helpful tips about both organizing your day in terms of time and organizing your day in terms of place. And one piece of advice that I'll give that's going to foreshadow some of the later questions about sleep is really the recommendation is to not do work in bed. So the recommendation from every society that's ever done research on sleep hygiene is that bed specifically should be a place for sleep and intimate activity. And as tempting as it is to lie in your bed, watching a movie on your laptop, or replying to emails, or watching your lectures if you're a student or something, that really tends to create disassociations in the brain between what the bed is intended to be for and what people actually use it for. And we know that poor sleep is a huge predictor of poor performance in all domains of life.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add to that? It seems we're talking about organization and time management in this kind of world that we're in, and structuring time for the students. And I think that's so important. I mean, my experience at the school would be whenever we're dealing with students that are struggling either emotionally or academically, it really comes down to, for the most part, among other things, an organizational problem. So, I think one of the things that I could add to some of those tips or strategies that were already given would be students or families, for that matter, I think need to structure their days and organize their timetables using what I call guiding principles, and fill their time according to what those principles are, and how valuable they are to their lives. As a suggestion, for example, we have guiding principles at our school, and our guiding principles is to develop young men who live lives of faith, character, and service, and we develop body, mind, and spirit. And so, using that as a guiding principle, I think in organizing and structuring our day, we need to be intentional about making time for our bodies, our fitness, or our mind and our knowledge, or our spirit, and making time, or being intentional about making time for prayer and whatnot. And when you kind of put all those things together and you organize that through the course of the day, for the most part, I think by the end of the day, kids will be tired and thus ready to sleep.
So it's interesting that you say that, because we're all staring at summer right now, shortly starting. The school year is going to end soon. And a lot of parents are wondering, how in the world am I going to be able to help and support and maintain learning or engagement, motivation, all of these things over the summer months? Dr. Lemieux, do you want to tackle that one in terms of, has the honeymoon period around digital learning, it feels like it's ended, and how do you support parents moving forward who might have kids who have to go to summer school, et cetera, et cetera?
It's a very good question, Lianne. Thank you. I think going back to the culture of accountability that I was talking about earlier, that goes for the digital, but also our life. Again, I blur the boundaries between the digital and the non-digital, because for me, we use them every day in our Western society. So we talked about structure. We talk about also scheduling. So scheduling goes as well for this summer. In terms of that culture of accountability, if you're a parent, you work Monday to Friday from 9 to 5, you have technically, in most cases, you have a schedule, right? So my recommendation tip for parents would be to have your agenda, your paper one or your Google one, and to show it to your child, your adolescent, and say, look, this is what my schedule looks like today. What does yours look like? Okay. Because again, you don't want to go into policing and saying, show me your schedule. You need to be organized if you don't do it yourself. So it's that culture of accountability within the family that should be present, again, for that to be successful at home. A lot of skills can be developed over the summer, especially for those who are entering a university in the fall. It's an exciting time. So things like financial literacy, food literacy, digital literacy, music, craft, folk, all those things that can be learned at home, that can be fostered with the help of a parent. I'm gonna emphasize the first two, so food literacy. Okay, so I would say this is one of the best skills that students can have, especially if they will live on their own, granted that, you know, life will pick up again. And financial literacy is another one. So how to make a budget, how to you know, plan for savings and things like that. So those are all skills that parents, I feel, could teach their kids, and that are going to be helpful in the long run.
We've got a few questions here in the chat bar, so let me throw the first one out here. It says, during the summer break, what can we do when they shut you off? So we're talking about teenage boys, of course, and don't let you come into their room or don't listen to you. You can't force a teenager to do something they don't want to do. Mark, would you have a suggestion on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess my question would be, you know, and then this, you don't necessarily need to elaborate on this, but, and we can take this offline certainly, but, you know, this is very rarely a binary event, right? So it's not like everything was going fine and then suddenly your child is, you know, upset, won't let you into their room. You know, in very, very rare situations it's a blip on the radar and then things return to normal. But in general, when that happens, you know, you don't ask the follow-up question. And so often that's a sign that there has either been some sort of deterioration in the child-parent relationship or some other part of the child's domains of being that's causing this relatively dysfunctional stress response. Right, and so the question would be to explore, you know, what's been going on, and then to give your child some options and in kind of a low stakes, conflict free, you know, circumstance where they can approach you on their own time, just to start to raise some of these issues. Right, so the last thing that you want to do is force a showdown and say like, look, I know something's going on, like what is it? Because that's really like an end stage crisis situation. You're going to be much better off trying to explore, you know, are there recent stressors? Is there a breakup with a, you know, an intimate relationship with a partner? Is there a, you know, is there falling out in a friend group at school? Are there, you know, other stressors either at home or in like the immediate family that might be contributing? And then just to let your son know that they're, you know, you're available and happy to talk to them about it, that you recognize that this is going on, that they don't need to tell you everything all at once, that this is going to be an evolving process and that you're open to having a conversation. Or suggest alternatives if they don't want to talk to you. Suggest that there are alternatives, either, you know, through their physician or through some of the other support services through the school or through your community, where they should at least consider talking to someone. You know, even if it's not immediately you, and even if you're not the person that they disclose all of the information to, even if you're just an intermediary. So I think that's a much better approach to it, as a guiding principle, really, for anyone that's in a similar situation, without necessarily being able to address the specific situation of, you know, my kid came home, locked themselves in their room, and they don't want to talk to me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think if I could add to that, it's important to talk, and that really goes without saying. My experience tells me that sometimes students or, you know, kids of this age don't know how to talk, and sometimes the parents don't know how to talk either. And so I think there's some value in learning a language so that this can come out. And so if parents or students are shutting their parents out, I would ask the question, why? What's happening? There has to be different or a number of layers there, and the talk has to try and peel back those layers to get to the heart of it. And I think the way to do it in a more technical way would be to incorporate some social emotional learning into the lives of the kids. And that simply means, you know, without being so technical, that simply means giving your child permission to feel, is the way I would describe it, and let him express or learn how to express those feelings. Be open to the way he's expressing those feelings, but don't be controlling. I think the job of the parent is to guide, not to control. And it becomes quite easy to try to control the situation and sort of put your hand or put your foot down and demand things. But as in the question that was stated, I think that might backfire sometimes when you try and force too much. Learning a language, I think, would be part of the solution here.
Another question for you, Frank, from the chat. This one coming from an incoming parent and student entering grade 9 in September at St. Michael's. His biggest concern is how he's going to meet new friends in the world of physical and social distancing that we live in, and also in the world of closed school buildings right at the moment. He feels disconnected and is not interested in online opportunities to connect with new students and people he doesn't know. Is there any advice you can offer on that?
It's a great question, because we know that education, rests primarily on the social engagement of all of the stakeholders, and that's student to student, student to teacher, and so on and so forth. So that connectedness is really important when it comes to the learning environment. I can say that it is something that the school is currently considering in terms of how to address this come September, should we be in an online world. And we're dealing with a number of ways on how to connect the kids and keep true to our motto of developing mind, body, and spirit. One activity that I would suggest, without going into a whole lot of detail, and I've often suggested this to the university students, or our grads going into university, I should say, and that is to prepare over the summer a self-introduction, and take some time with it. What do you want? What would you like your classmates to know about you? What would you like your teacher to know about you? And put some critical thinking behind that, not just, a few things about playing baseball and so on. Dig deep into who you are and send that to your teacher. Your teacher might read it, he might not read it, but I think he might value the fact that you took the time to express who you are prior to coming into that class. And then that teacher might use that information in trying to connect within the classroom online environment. Small activity might be useful.
That's a great tip. Dr. Lemieux, I want to ask you, is there such a thing as a sweet spot in terms of digital learning? We've got all kinds of different schools offering different number of hours of learning online, synchronous, asynchronous, et cetera, et cetera. At St. Michael's, it happens to be 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. In your research, is there anything that indicates a sweet spot? Should there be a balance of some kind in there?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lianne. So the research shows that for primary school students, for example, they can listen to lectures for 20 minutes. And for adolescents, it's double. So it's 40 minutes really. So the sweet spot is kind of there. The tip with digital teachers is to, or teachers teaching digitally online, is to mix that up with small groups. So if they're going to talk for 40 minutes, say at a maximum, synchronously, then they're going to do group activity or a reflection or solo work or group work, which is also possible to do online. So I would say 40 minutes, and even for university students, we're talking around that time, like 50, maybe an hour, but we're stretching it at an hour, I find. That would be the sweet spot.
So when you add that schedule to the fact that every other activity is happening online, social, et cetera, entertainment, et cetera, then what does that look like in terms of what a typical day is, in terms of number of hours spent in front of a screen, which is a huge issue for all of us?
Absolutely, Lianne. I think we're talking about very different types of activities that are being done online. So right now what we're doing is socializing, but also intellectually speaking to each other. So that takes a lot of energy. Think about movies too. I always go back to movies. It's a kind of intellectual activity that's digital. So if we watch a movie for an hour and a half, that's kind of a sweet spot for us because we're engaging in narrative storytelling. If there's a lecture being given to students, they have to cognitively engage. So it's reasonable to say 40 minutes of cognitively engaging, taking notes and knowing what the teacher is talking about and rationalizing. So that's a different type of digital activity. When kids are gaming, that's completely different because they're producing. They have a controller and they're part of the story. They're part of the story world. They're part of the action. So they don't want that to stop really, because they're really part of that environment as if we were, you know, going by and doing our activities. So that's another thing that's different. When we're FaceTiming, we're creating bonds with each other. We're creating social relations with each other. So that's another type of different activity. When we're browsing the internet, we're reading. So that requires a different level. So I would say, again, I would go back to the UNESCO recommendations about what we do online, right? And then the time that's associated to these digital literacy activities.
Related to that, a question in the chat. My son is gaming 5 hours a day. We have a schedule which he abides by, but I still feel 5 hours is too much. Is 5 hours of gaming too much, considering that there's also a social component with that for a lot of these boys?
I think your son is right. So thank you for asking that question. So I think your son is right in part. So he's socializing, yes, but I think 5 hours of anything is too much. Okay. 5 hours of eating, 5 hours of crocheting, 5 hours of walking. I think it's a bit excessive. So what you might do as a parent is not to go in that policing dynamic, because what that's going to do is that it's going to increase the gaming. But what you want to do instead is go back to that dynamic of accountability. Show your own schedule. You say, oh, listen, I do 2 hours of crocheting a day. You're going to do 2 hours of gaming a day. I talk about my crocheting with and so. That's when you're going to talk about your gaming with your friends. So it's all, if it's a hobby where you socialize, that's great. I would recommend maybe, and even 2 is kind of stretching it. I think maybe 1 could be great. But yeah, whenever something is overwhelming like that, like anything, it has to be accounted for.
And certainly balanced. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Mark, question for you from the chat as well.
Sure.
It has to do a bit with policing. So in other words, if the tension ensues between how many hours, what are you doing, whatever the source of the tension is, and you know, there's all kinds of work from home going on, etc. Emotions are high. Is there any strategies that you can suggest parents could use to reduce that fighting with their children?
So first of all, my recommendation to anyone in terms of navigating through conflict is to pick your battles, right? So identify first the things that you actually want your child to change. And then second, also interrogate your own reasons, right? So using the previous example, you know, why do you think that 5 hours of gaming is excessive? Well, by contrast, if you said, you know, my kid practices, you know, basketball for 5 hours, do you think that that's excessive? Why or why not? You know, do you think that they're failing to develop other activities? Do you think that it's unhealthy to be sitting sedentary for that amount of time? Are you worried about the strain on their eyes? Are you worried that, you know, the specific content of the game that's violent and is teaching? And I'm not suggesting that any of these things are good or bad reasons, but just ask yourself why it is that you feel or think the way that you do. Because then you're going to be coming to your child with a well-articulated position, and then that gives them something to engage with, right? It sounds less authoritarian to say, I think this is a bad idea because of reasons, as opposed to I think this is a bad idea. Which is why I absolutely agree with Dr. Lemieux about, you know, the reciprocity of accountability. If you think it's a bad idea for your child to be on their cell phone after 9, you should also either A, be off your cell phone, or B, justify why it's okay for you to do it sometimes. Because especially as you help boys transition to a more independent version of adolescence and young adulthood in grades 11 and 12, and then in university, and then or whatever it is they choose to do after their high school career, you know, the adult world has symmetrical rules for everybody. It's equally wrong for me to go assault someone on the street as it would be for Frank, or it would be for Lianne, or for any of you. And where there are exceptions are clearly defined. You know, use of force is more appropriate for people in the military and the armed forces. It's, it's particularly frowned upon for people with, with racist or bigoted motivations behind that or something. But the rules tend to be symmetrical and they tend to be uniformly applied. And so your own household should operate similar to the rest of the world, where you have symmetrical and uniformly applied rules with justifications. And then the other thing is, if you're going to live by that rule, you have to accept that sometimes your children will lawyer you out of doing whatever it is or not doing whatever it is that they're supposed to. They come up with good arguments, let them win. That's how the rest of the world works. If your boss gives you an unreasonable assignment and you send back an email, if your concerns are legitimate and they're not acknowledged, you feel frustrated. Right? If your concerns are acknowledged, then you feel empowered and you feel more motivated to overlook some other minor inconveniences. It'll be the same thing with your kids. Everyone's worried that if you're going to give them an inch, they're going to push you all the way. Not really. If they've worked hard for that inch, give them their inch. They deserved it.
Interesting. Frank, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the question about the time on how much time is being spent on the activity, I don't like to think of this as far as a time factor, rather than what I think is probably more important is there a variety of activities going on in the boy's life? Is he touching upon all of the aspects that life has to offer him? I think that's probably more important than trying to decide on whether it's 3 hours or 2 hours or 1 hour. I think when I hear parents and children talk, when it comes to this aspect, it becomes a debate on that number, which sometimes the child, well, most time the child just doesn't get, because he wants to be there for 5 hours, right? And so rather than put the spin on the number, make sure there's a number of activities that he can get involved with. And I think the trick there is to find out what he's interested in. And that goes back to what our earlier conversation was about, and that's talking to him and let him talk to you.
You had some great suggestions actually in preparation for this about, ideas for how to engage boys over the summer, during the school year. Do you want to share some of those?
Well, over the summer, we know, for example, that there are a lot of parents already registering their kids in summer school, which is a good idea. We don't know what summer school is going to look like, but I would add to that is summer school may not be for every student. Just putting him into a classroom or an online classroom during these days may not be the right thing for that student. If he needs remedial help, if he needs extra support with his schoolwork, it might be more prudent to speak to his current teachers and find out what prerequisite skills is he missing that he could work on over the summer, and maybe hire a tutor or parent the kid with specifically those skills. And the question would be, what skills does my student need to reinforce in order to get to the next level and succeed at the next level? Because that's what summer school does. Now, if summer school is not possible, or not for your child, then I think the trick is trying to find out what interests your child. And I think that has to do in this world with parenting. And so, organizing dinner debates, for example, that reinforces the persuasive skills, presentation skills. But I would say organize a debate that the child can prepare himself for. And as a parent, model the behavior that has to be exhibited in that debate. So you might do some research to prepare for that debate. And it might be a topic that you don't know anything about. It might be something, for example, related to gaming or his favorite sports team that you don't particularly like. Do some research so he knows that you are invested in this kind of program as well. Permitting your child to do a building project at the home, I think, is a valuable exercise. And letting him do it from beginning to end. Plan out the project, do the diagrams, write out the directions, plan the materials and so on and so forth. Then begin the project, use the tools if tools are needed. Permit him to experiment, keep him safe at all times, of course, but allow him to fail if he fails and start over again. Those are just a couple of things that you might do to engage interests for the student if summer school isn't available.
It's interesting because we've gotten a lot of questions over the course of Parent Talks on the idea of, mental wellness as it relates to what you just alluded to, allowing a child to fail. And when we're in a pandemic, we've got all kinds of emotions going on. Mark, I'm wondering, that sense of loss, and we talked about this in the last Parent Talks a little bit, the sense of loss, whether it's, no graduation ceremony as it normally happens, or, physical distancing, all these different things. What advice can you provide to parents about how to manage that in their sons?
I think that's a great question. I mean, so we start with the understanding that your children and you, by having made it this far, are have the capacity for resilience. And so resilience is a teachable skill, but there's also some innate capacity in it that human beings have. Human beings historically have been able to overcome tremendous tragedy and then live through quite meaningful and quite fulfilling lives. COVID isn't that, right? So I see a lot of people comparing this to the World War II of our time, the great sacrifice of our generation, whatever. Like really the economic toll is a completely different issue. But from a personal level, this is a level of tragedy. I think it's facile to compare this to something momentous like World War II or the Holocaust. Like just that diminishes the suffering of those people and it diminishes the reality of this conflict. We sat on our couches for 3 months. Like this is not the end of the world. That said, there are certain ways that you can help normalize this sense of loss without necessarily either overinflating or dismissing the impact of a pandemic and social isolation. And so my biggest recommendation would be to share how this has made your own life hard, right? To be open about your own feelings. And this is something that Frank alluded to earlier. For your children to have fluency in having conversations about their feelings, which is a prerequisite for having healthy responses to their own feelings, that's a learned skill, right? And so the best people to model this are going to be you and your family members. And so model emotional honesty, right? Model the ability to be vulnerable, model the ability to show loss, and show that it's okay, right? That you don't need to have this stoic bravado about whatever, it's all fine. But you also don't need to let this be something that's paralyzing and crippling, like, oh, woe is me, I can never have a meaningful adolescent experience, like I can never go to prom, I'm going to miss out on this pivotal life event. And so try to strike the balance between accepting, yes, it sucks that we don't get to see grandma and grandpa anymore, and it's it's been really hard for me, and yeah, it's also been hard for me that I can't go out for movies with my friends. I'm sure there's things like that in your life that are hard, right? And for many people, just talking and acknowledging that they've lost something is part of the healthy grieving process. And so once you start with the acknowledgement that, yes, I used to have this, it's unfortunate that we don't anymore, how are we going to move forward? You start to normalize this idea that loss doesn't necessarily have to be transformative or paralyzing, that it's just something that you process and move forward through. That would be my first advice.
Yeah. Dr. Lemieux, I want to pivot the discussion a little bit to something that we talked about earlier on in the conversation, but getting into some evidence-based research around the physical ramifications of screen time and too much screen time. Eye strain, vision, for example. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So there is evidence-based research that says that there's blue light coming out of our screen. So what blue light does is really, it affects some parts of the retina that allows us to visually memorize things. It's not exactly those words, but there's some memory enzymes there. And what it does, the research shows is that it alters sleep cycles, really, okay? So it's not so much myopia, okay? Although there is some research that says if you spend too much time close to a screen or close to writing, you're gonna develop myopia in the years to come. So that's why researchers recommend a lot of physical activity to kind of counterbalance, and a lot of, not staring too much, and also the luminosity. So if you have devices Make sure that your devices and that of your child, the luminosity is decreased. There's also filters. There's blue light glasses that block those intensities on your screen. So those are little things that we can do to help that, especially if we're asked to do all this stuff online and then gaming and things like that. But it's mostly sleep cycle. So for example, if your child has his phone in the bedroom, and then he wakes up at 2 a.m. and he picks up his phone, his first biological reaction, and really we're talking about a biological reaction, when you open the phone, you're gonna do like this, right? Because the light is so bright in contrast to the room that is so dark. So it's not recommended to, one, have the device within the room, and second, to open it in the middle of the night. So it's just those little digital literacy things that I feel like our adolescents should be aware of, and that it's going to impact their sleep in the long run, and then motivation, and then engagement, and things like that. So, yeah.
In the last 10 minutes, I wanted to sort of talk about what the future of digital learning looks like. And this is certainly an area of your research, and you've been researching it for quite a bit. So what can we expect in terms of trends as we look forward, Dr. Lemieux?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know at the university level, you're going to see more and more teachers doing training in that, and you're going to see a lot of teachers going back to school and doing those master's degrees on digital literacy and things like that. So that's a given. We're going to have, I think, more hybrid classes, especially in September. I know there's universities that are going online fully. And maybe coming back, and then we're going to have those more hybrid kind of things where maybe 1 week is going to be online, the other week is going to be in person, or like 3 days a week online and 2 days in person, things like that. So we're going to see education shifting and having those things adapted. In terms of online learning, you're going to see a lot more people investing, whether it's schools or parents, investing in ergonomic stuff. So for example, I have a keyboard here that's ergonomic, because when I type fast, and then it hurts less, right? Things like, I have a mouse here that's ergonomic. It really takes the shape of my hand. So I'm moving my mouse like this instead of like this, because if I'm like this, then ergonomically it's going to hurt. So I think there's going to be a lot of strain on our bodies, and we're going to look at ways to be more comfortable in doing our work on the everyday.
Frank, did you want to add anything to that in terms of trends that you're seeing?
I think the trick, trends is a difficult thing to talk about, because it's just such an uncertain time and everything is totally brand new. We don't have a playbook for this. There's no experience that we have that we can, rely on when it comes to this. But I do know that the language out there amongst all of the educational leaders is that these are unprecedented times. We face immense challenges. There is uncertainty. We have to all be patient. I think Mark said this earlier. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And so the future of education, or the future of online learning, I think will take the form of a lot of different faces. Where we land, it'll be some time. What that looks like, I think is very difficult. I think there'll be a lot of experiments happening in the next little while as far as what we think will work. But I would say, as a close to this, one of the things that we have to keep in mind that is the education cannot simply be content driven. There has to be a relational aspect to it somehow. We live in a world where content is so easily found, and we're talking about being on screens and so on and so forth, and students can find information so quickly. And so learning about themselves, learning the language that we talked about earlier, I think that's so important when it comes to where this will land.
Mark, as somebody on the front lines of where this will land, what are you seeing? I mean, we've all heard at this point about the impact on mental health, not just now, but looking forward here. In this age group, what are you seeing currently, and what are you looking at in terms of trends?
I think the hardest thing, so like all upheavals, this tends to hit people that are the most vulnerable, and so most vulnerable depends on what area you're talking about. Right? So financially, this has hit people who are most vulnerable financially much harder, and they're much more worse off than than people who already had access to resources. And similarly, from a mental health and social relationships perspective, the people that were already at risk tend to be the ones that are struggling the most with this, right? So if you're already cool on Instagram and TikTok, like being in a pandemic just makes you get to capitalize on the skills and the social connections and the ways of relating that you were already stronger on. So if you're someone who was more ostracized in person, there tends to be a homogeneity between people's relational social status in the physical world and their relational social status digitally, and especially at the small scale high school level. So the cool kids in real life tend to have the most likes and followers on all of their relative social media. And so when you look at the people that get ostracized, those are often the people that were already most at risk of being ostracized, and they tend to have outsized impacts on their mental health in terms of in terms of their mood responses and some consequent negative coping strategies, whether or not it's predispositions towards risk-taking behavior or substance abuse or self-harm or other types of social dysfunction. And so keeping an eye out, that doesn't necessarily mean that those of you with children who are thriving and successful and confident don't have anything to worry about. Like, absolutely, that's not a fixed thing. It can always change. But if you were worried that that there were some issues with relating, or you were worried that there were some issues with bullying, or if you were worried that there were some issues in terms of self-esteem previously, or poor coping strategies previously, those are things that are going to get magnified by something like this. And that's what we're seeing is the people that had mild to moderate depression are now coming in with much worse, with worsening symptoms relative to what we would expect for the natural progression of their disease. What that looks like as the pandemic goes on, I'm not sure. Over time, anyone's coping strategies can get overwhelmed. But that would just be my piece of advice. Look to where the most vulnerable people are, because that's where you're going to find the earliest and most intense impacts.
Frank, last word on advice for parents. We're getting questions in the chat about keeping them occupied in the summer, activities, suggestions around that.
I think the trick is to appeal to their interests. All kids have different interests. I mean, some kids want to be outdoors all the time. Some kids, want to be indoors. I think motivating and engaging them is the trick. Some activities, if you want to be outside, as I mentioned earlier, would be a building project. I think you want to try and connect what they can learn in school with what's out there in the real world, because of the fact that I said earlier, this cannot be content driven. So, going on hikes and talking about the ecosystem, for example, that might be a regular activity. Going fishing, I think might be an activity, and talking about, biology and so on. Those are valuable activities that you can accomplish with your kids, and above all else, you'll be spending a lot of time with them and developing great positive relationships. And I think, now's the time, since we've had this sort of period of rapid transition to this world, and we're getting into the summer. Maybe it's time just to pause and reflect on what we did, what went well, what needs to be fixed, and what will it look like in the future. We have an opportunity now, as the summer is coming up, to answer those kinds of questions, not only for ourselves as educators, but also as parents with your own kids. And so I think those are valuable questions that you can answer to come up with your own activities. I think that's a critical aspect. Above all else, we talk about this, summer learning loss when we finish in June, and there's going to be a summer of activity, and then September comes around, we got to get back into the swing of things. But we've just added a pandemic on that, so we've just added 6 months to that learning loss. I think the trick is to try and find ways that the world can mimic what we tried to teach in the classroom. And that's a really unique thing from child to child.
Dr. Lemieux, last word on what everyone's calling the new normal, and it's safe to assume that the digital world that we've all entered here through this pandemic is going to be the one that we are going to be in for the foreseeable future. So what advice could you provide to parents in terms of how they can support their sons from an academic perspective and doing all of their everything in a digital space?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lianne. I think a tip that I would give parents in my experience, I was a high school teacher before that, and then I turned into academia and being a professor. And seeing those Q&As, I think the common thread here is to teach a culture at home of gratefulness and what we're grateful for in the situations that we have. So, not just saying to your kid, what are you grateful for? Have a more subtle approach to that. So let's do an exercise tomorrow morning at breakfast. So for example, I'd say, hi, Max. I'm really grateful to have you as my son. I'm really grateful for everything you did this year, and you went through a lot. That's teaching a culture of being grateful. And then after doing that, you ask them what they're grateful for. If there's an awkward silence, because it's probably a question that's going to throw them off, okay? Have them being in tune with those emotions and being aware of what they have and what they can work with. And that it goes in the online realm and it goes on the offline realm, but it's making those connections together and looking towards hopeful futures.
What are you looking forward to most as we move forward here?
I'm looking forward to have people being authentically connected in moments like this and really working together for our kids and what they need in the future. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much for your thoughts this evening and your perspectives. That is our time for this edition of Parent Talks. Our thanks to our panelists, Frank Trentadue from St. Michael's College School, Dr. Amélie Lemieux from Mount St. Vincent University, and Dr. Mark Broussenko, family physician and hospitalist at CAMH in Toronto. As you exit this webinar, there is an opportunity to participate in a survey, so we invite you to do that. We take your feedback very seriously, and we will certainly implement that as we move forward. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.